Welcome to General Anthropology, or Anthropology 2000, and a double welcome to all of you to Module 1, using anthropological perspectives. So just for future reference, I'll probably be using video in future lectures once I can figure it out, so please bear with me for the first couple weeks as I learn. Anyway, back to the lecture. So in this first lecture, we're going to do three big things. First, we'll talk about what anthropology actually is and why it's different from other social sciences. Second, we'll unpack the idea of culture, what it means, what it does, and why anthropologists care about it so much. Third, we'll zoom out and we'll ask, what can you actually do with anthropology? And why does it matter for your life, for your major, or for your future work? This lecture is organized into 2 mini lectures and 2 short reflection pauses. But feel free to pause the video anytime. Please take some notes, rewind at any time you'd like, anything to make sure that you're comfortable and that you are understanding the material. Anthropology is really just meant how to stretch out how you see the world. By the end of this module, you should be able to define anthropology, explain its central narrative commitments, and distinguish its 4 main subfields. Then we'll turn to culture, what it is, how it's learned, how it's shared, and how things like norms and values and symbols organize everyday life. Finally, we'll connect all of this to you, to your experiences, your major, and the possible careers where anthropology skills really matter. These goals all line up directly with chapter 1 of your textbook, one of your textbooks anyway, the one that's titled Exploring Our World. The first thing I want to do this semester is introduce all of you to this wonderful discipline of anthropology. I often notice that when I tell people that I'm an anthropologist, they really don't know what that means. So hopefully this will clear some of those things up. Essentially, anthropology is a social science that's focused on what makes us human and on our shared humanity across time and space. The word itself actually comes from the Greek anthropos, which means human, and the second half of the word logia, which means study. So put them together, what you get is the study of humans. Anthropologists also use both qualitative methods like interviews, observation, life histories, and quantitative methods like surveys, measurements, and statistical analysis to answer questions about human experience. But, key question here, how is all of this different from, say, sociology or psychology? Well, anthropology's key features really distinguish it from other disciplines. First, anthropology is holistic. Instead of isolating one part of life, like studying just politics or just religion, we ask how many different parts fit together. So we might look at a culture and study its economy, its kinship structures, its belief systems, its language, the environment, and more. Second, anthropology is comparative. We learn by putting different societies, time periods, or groups side by side and asking what's similar here, or what's different, and why. Third, anthropology relies heavily on the concept of cultural relativism, which to say that anthropology is relativistic means something specific. What it means is that we're trying to understand practices, cultural practices, on their own cultural terms before deciding how we feel about them. So it's sort of like understand first, judge later type of thing. And finally, anthropology is culture focused. We really care about how humans learn, how they share, how they contest meanings, how we decide what counts as normal or as sacred, as gross, as beautiful. All of these things are deeply, deeply cultural, and anthropologists are very interested in studying all of them. So for this course, I'd like you to treat anthropology as sort of a set of lenses that you can just put on or take off when you want to. And when you put on the anthropological lens, you'll start to see that everyday things like, how you dress for class or how you greet people, who cooks dinner in your family, or who gets blamed when something goes wrong, all these things start to suddenly look different with an anthropological lens. You start seeing these everyday practices as cultural patterns, ones that can be questioned and analyzed, and not just simply the way things are. One of your textbooks for this class, again, the Exploring Our World textbook, describes a kind of central story that holds anthropology together. It goes roughly something like this. Humans have developed flexible biological and social features that, in many different environments and in many different historical moments, have produced a remarkable diversity of cultures. 3 big commitments come out of that story. The first is the commitment to explore cultural diversity. Anthropologists document and analyze the many, many different ways of being human, from small-scale foraging groups to large industrial nations like our own, from online communities to urban neighborhoods. The idea here is not to rank cultures from better to worse, worse to better, primitive to advanced, something like that, but rather to understand there are different solutions to similar human problems. In each culture you study, there are specific actions and patterns that arise with regard to key human questions, like how to raise children, how to manage conflict, how to worship, how to distribute resources, and so on. The second commitment that is really central to anthropology is the commitment to understanding how societies hold together. Anthropology is, like I mentioned before, holistic. We ask how different institutions and practices fit into a broader system. For example, if we study schooling, then we also look at families, economic inequality, language ideologies, even media and religion, because all of these different things can shape what happens in the classroom. The third commitment, equally important, is anthropology's commitment to examine human nature interdependence. After all, humans don't just live on the planet, we live with it. Anthropologists examine how different environments shape cultures. Think of coastal fishing communities versus desert pastoral communities, right? And think about how culture reshapes environments, whether that's through irrigation, dams, mining, or climate-changing industries. These 3 commitments, exploring cultural diversity, understanding how societies hold together, and examining human nature interdependence, these form the backbone of anthropology. And the 4 subfields of anthropology that we're about to discuss each tackle these questions from a different angle. To take on something as huge as, quote, humans across all times and places, anthropology is organized into 4 major subfields. You can sort of think of them as 4 different doors into the same big house. First, there's biological anthropology, which studies evolution, genetics, primates, and human variation. Then there's archaeology, which looks at the past through excavated remains, like bones, skeletons, ceramics, all sorts of different kinds of artifacts. The third is linguistic anthropology. That is the study of language. And finally, there's cultural anthropology, which focuses on studying contemporary cultures. So that's just a brief overview, but I want to review these 4 subfields in a bit more detail. So here we go. First, biological or physical anthropology. Biological anthropologists study humans as biological organisms, but always, always, always in relation to culture and environment. So here are some concrete examples. To study human evolution, Researchers that work in biological anthropology might analyze fossil hominins like the early Homo species to understand things like how bipedalism, the fact that we walk on 2 feet, or how brain size or the use of tools has changed over time. Other researchers in this subdiscipline are primatologists, which means that they study primates, chimps, gorillas, lemurs, you name it. And they ask what primate social behavior can tell us about the evolutionary roots of human cooperation, human aggression, human parenting, or human communication. Another area for biological anthropology is the study of human variation and health. Biological anthropologists might compare how bodies adapt to high altitude in the Andes versus in the Himalayas. Or maybe they might study how nutrition and stress show up in bones and teeth. Biological anthropologists also engage in forensic anthropology. Some forensic anthropologists specialize in identifying human remains in legal contexts. So maybe they identify remains to help solve crimes, or to help identify victims of disasters, or even to investigate human rights abuses. So that's a little bit about what biological anthropology does. Next is archaeology. Archaeologists study past cultures, mostly through the things that people left behind. But they don't just dig up treasure. They're trying to reconstruct everyday life. Some examples include prehistoric archaeology. Prehistoric archaeology involves studying stone tools, animal bones, hearths, and cave art, all to understand how hunter-gatherers organized their camps, how they hunted, and how they shared food. There's also classical or historical archaeology. This kind of archaeologist might study ancient cities in places like Greece or Egypt or Mesoamerica, to see how people built monuments or how they governed, worshipped, or traded. Household archaeology is another area that can involve sifting through trash pits, looking at pottery, examining house foundations, all to learn what families ate and how they divided up their labor, or how class and gender worked in daily life. Or there's underwater archaeology, which can mean investigating shipwrecks to understand trade routes, or warfare, or even migration. Archaeologists might ask questions like, how did climate change affect the collapse of certain societies? How did agriculture transform social inequality? Or what do burial practices reveal about belief and status? The key distinction here is that archaeologists are very much focused on cultures of the past. Linguistic anthropologists study language as a key to culture. So they're not only interested in things like grammar, they're more interested in how people use language in real life. So, for instance, they might study something like language and identity, like how people code switch between Spanish and English at home and at work, and what that kind of code switching reveals about identity, power, and belonging in second-generation Latina families. One example. Linguistic anthropologists might also study endangered languages. They might work to document languages with very few speakers left. This could involve working with communities to preserve stories and songs and vocabulary, all before they disappear. They could also look at language and power. Linguistic anthropologists analyze things like political speeches and courtroom talk and doctor-patient interactions to see how language can reinforce or even challenge authority. Some even study digital communication. So these kinds of linguistic anthropologists see memes and reels, emojis, hashtags as new symbolic systems. These systems, even though they might be online or digital, they still shape how we relate to each other offline. So a very interesting and sort of new area of study for folks working in linguistic anthropology. And just to give you one more example, a linguistic anthropologist might ask a question like, how does calling someone an illegal alien versus an undocumented worker shape public opinion? Or maybe, how do kids learn what counts as polite speech? These are both fair questions that linguistic anthropologists would have a lot to say about. Finally, cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropologists focus mostly on contemporary cultures and everyday life. They typically do their work by living within a community for months or even years. They might learn the language, they might participate in the daily activities of those communities, and be really involved almost as insiders of the communities that they study. This is really unique, and it's called ethnographic fieldwork. So some examples of projects that use ethnographic fieldwork could be a cultural anthropologist studying how migrants maintain ties to their home communities while building new lives in another country. Or they might examine how religious rituals help people cope with uncertainty or grief or a major life transition. They might also investigate how people navigate health and illness, and that's actually what my research involves as a cultural/medical anthropologist. So for example, a cultural anthropologist might look at how patients decide whether to trust biomedical doctors, traditional healers, or online communities with their health. Looking at youth subcultures like skateboarders or K-pop fans or gamers is also something that cultural anthropologists do. And they study these so-called subcultures to see how identity and community are created and how they flourish within these communities. So a cultural anthropologist might ask questions such as, how do people make meaning even when they're faced with inequality or crisis? They might ask, how do global processes like tourism or social media show up in local everyday practices? All of these are key questions for cultural anthropology. And just a word in summation, even though each of the 4 subfields I've reviewed has its own methods and its own particular set of questions, all of the subfields inform each other. So a project on climate change adaptation, for instance, might bring together archaeological evidence of past droughts with biological data on health, cultural data on farming practices, and a linguistic analysis of how people talk about nature and risk. That's one example of how the 4 disciplines really do work together and can inform each other and make for even richer investigations and studies within anthropology. Also important to note that these 4 subfields, they don't just live only in universities. They also show up in applied anthropology, where anthropologists use their skills to tackle problems in the real world. So some concrete examples of applied anthropology. One would be forensic anthropology or biological anthropology. So it might involve working with medical examiners or police or even human rights organizations to identify remains from crime scenes. Or they might work on identifying individuals who were buried in mass graves or who died in natural disasters. Then cultural resource management, or CRM, which is more closely associated with archaeology, is another way that anthropology gets applied to solve problems in the real world. And what CRM is, or what it involves, are things like surveying land before a construction project happens, like a highway or building a pipeline. And they would do this to locate and protect archaeological sites in those areas and to negotiate how to preserve or document them. Another area of applied anthropology involves language documentation and education. And as you can probably guess, this is more closely associated with linguistic anthropologists. So a linguistic anthropologist working in an applied domain might collaborate with communities to develop writing systems or dictionaries or teaching materials for endangered languages. Another area of applied anthropology, which is my area, is medical anthropology, which can also involve development and public health. And this is associated most closely with cultural anthropology. Medical anthropologists who work in an applied setting might design health programs that actually, fit people's beliefs and their daily realities. For example, they might try to understand why people are hesitant to get vaccinated, or why a water purification campaign fails even if the technology works. Then there's corporate and user design research, which is often taken up by cultural and linguistic anthropologists. And this involves observing how people actually use apps, websites, or products and bringing those insights back to design teams. So when someone asks, what can I actually do with anthropology? One answer is studying humans from many, many angles. Another answer is take that understanding and channel it into all kinds of jobs. You could work with an anthropology skill set. You could work in a museum or an NGO, a hospital, a tech company, a government agency, you name it. The skills that are taught in anthropology classes are incredibly applicable across a variety of careers and domains. So before we move on, I just want to give you a moment to connect this material to your own life. So after I'm finished talking, just go ahead and pause the video and take a few minutes to respond to the prompts that I'm going to put up on the screen. You can respond in your head or in writing. I usually advocate for writing it down. You don't have to show this to anyone unless you want to. It's mainly just for you to start thinking like an anthropologist. So here are the prompts. First, which anthropological subfield interests you most and why? Think back to the 4 fields: biological, archaeological, linguistic, and cultural. And think back to the examples that we just went through. If you had to pick one right now, which one grabs your attention? What about it feels exciting or surprising? Second, what is one question about humans that you'd love to study? This could be huge and abstract, like why do humans form religions? Or very specific, like how do people use memes to cope with stress? Try to phrase it as an anthropological question, something you could imagine studying through observation, interviews, comparison, or historical or archival work. Third, where do you already see anthropology in your life, your major, or your future work? Maybe it's a job you're considering, or a community you're part of, or a social issue that you care about, or a topic that you follow online. How might an anthropological lens, one that is holistic, comparative, and culture-focused, help you understand that thing more deeply? Take a solid few minutes here, and when you're ready, unpause the video, and we'll keep going. You can hold on to any notes you take for your future response papers, so hint, hint, take some notes. They're also a really good first snapshot, of how you're coming into this course. Now that you've done some reflecting on the first half of this module lecture, I want to move on to mini lecture number 2. And this is where we take on the concept of culture, a deceptively simple word with many complex meanings. Culture it's one of those words that gets used absolutely everywhere. In company culture, in cancel culture, in pop culture. But anthropology gives it a more precise and I think a more useful meaning. So classically, anthropologist E.B. Tyler described culture as a, quote, complex whole that includes things like knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by humans as members of society. Another anthropologist, Clifford Geertz, he added that humans are, quote, animals suspended in webs of significance, which is to say, essentially, that humans have spun these webs themselves, and culture is those webs, the shared meanings and the symbols that we create and that we live inside. For this course, we're going to use a working definition that's simpler, but still powerful. Culture is the learned and shared knowledge and behaviors of a human group. Notice the emphasis on learned and shared. Why am I emphasizing these two things? Well, you weren't really born knowing what counts as polite, or how close to stand to someone, or how to dress for a job interview versus a day at the beach. You picked those things up by watching, listening, repeating, being corrected. Your culture does not live inside your DNA. It lives in your relationships, your routines, your institutions, and your stories. Also, culture is not just out there in exotic places. It's right here. It's in the simple, everyday things we really take for granted. It's in how you use your phone or what you eat for breakfast. It's how you talk to your professors or elders in your community. It's how you decide what counts as a success or a failure. One of the key properties of culture is that it is learned. Anthropologists refer to this process as enculturation or socialization. That's the constant, often invisible training that we undergo as we grow up. Think about some of your earliest routines. Standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. Knowing when to raise your hand in class. Understanding that you say trick or treat on Halloween. Or learning which words you don't say in front of adults. None of that is instinct. You learned it. You learned it from your parents, your teachers, your friends, TV shows, social media, and even just from being corrected or sometimes maybe even punished when you broke a rule. Because this training starts so early, our own cultural habits, they feel natural. They're almost invisible. And that's where a key concept for this class comes in, and that concept is ethnocentrism. Ethnocentrism is the tendency to see one's own culture as the default, as normal, or even as superior. We catch ourselves thinking, well, that's just how it's done. Or why would anyone do it that other way when we encounter a different practice? And ethnocentrism, it's bad, but it's not always malicious. It's more like a built-in side effect of relying on what we know to navigate the world. But it becomes a problem when it turns into judgment, or stereotyping, or justification for inequality and violence. When people suddenly find themselves in a very different cultural environment, they might experience something called culture shock. They feel tired, frustrated, super homesick, or super disoriented because their old mental maps, they don't quite work. Even simple tasks like going to the grocery store and buying food, or greeting someone, saying hello, or getting on a bus, all of these things become really effortful in a new cultural environment. So culture shock is actually a sign of something quite interesting and quite positive. It's a sign that our taken for granted assumptions about culture are being exposed, are being laid bare. And it's exhausting, but fascinating to start seeing those exposed cultural practices. So a big part, of learning anthropology is just becoming more aware of your own enculturation and your own ethnocentric reactions. And it's not meant to make you feel guilty. Instead, it's made to get you curious about where those reactions even come from. Importantly, culture is also shared. You are part of multiple overlapping cultural worlds. These can be national, regional, ethnic, religious, generational, online, whatever. and you share enough knowledge with others in those worlds that daily life is, for the most part, pretty predictable. So anthropologists, they break down this shared side of culture into a few key pieces, and I'm going to review them now. The first are norms. Norms are the shared rules or expectations for behavior. They might tell you which side of the road to drive on, or how loudly you can talk in a library, or whether it's appropriate to show up early, on time, or fashionably late. You usually only notice norms when someone violates them, like when someone stands way too close to you in line, or when someone overshares about their personal life in a work meeting. So those are norms. Next is values. Values are deeper ideas about what is good, right, or important. For example, many people in the US talk about valuing individual freedom, equality, or self-reliance. In other settings, people might emphasize different values like harmony, respect for elders, or collective responsibility. Values often explain why norms matter. We dress up for a funeral not just because it's a rule, but because we value respect for the dead and for grieving families. So, values, norms. Third, we have symbols. Symbols are anything that stands for something else and carries shared meaning. So that can include things like words, flags, logos, emojis, gestures, even foods. A red heart emoji, for example, it's not an anatomical diagram. It stands for affection or love. A wedding ring, it is a small metal circle, literally, that figuratively stands for a whole cluster of ideas about commitment, partnership, social status, and so on. These are the shared meanings that come out of our symbolic world, and anthropologists are very interested in this. Finally, cultural constructions. These are the categories and mental maps that we build to make sense of the world, that we build to make sense of, who counts as family, or what counts as a real job, what foods are acceptable for breakfast and which are not, how many genders we recognize, or how we sort people into racial or ethnic groups. These constructions, they feel natural, but in reality, they're really strongly shaped by history and power. One of anthropology's jobs is to show how these categories are made, how they are constructed, and how they could be constructed differently. Because ethnocentrism is such a powerful default, anthropologists develop the concept of cultural relativism as an antidote or a solution for ethnocentrism. Cultural relativism is the idea, and I've mentioned this briefly before, the idea that we should try to understand beliefs and practices in terms of the cultural context they belong to, rather than judging them immediately by our own standards. Cultural relativism asks us basically to slow down our reactions and ask instead, what does this practice mean to the people who do it? How is it connected to their history, economy, religion, social structure? For example, consider arranged marriage. From a US perspective that idealizes romantic love and individual choice, arranged marriage might seem oppressive. But when anthropologists study it in context, they often find complex systems of negotiation, family support, and shared responsibility, as well as people who are happy with arranged marriages, and also people who resist them. Without cultural relativism, we might miss what looks like agency, care, or strategy from within that system. It's important to stress that cultural relativism is a method, not a moral free-for-all. It doesn't require us to approve of everything we encounter. Instead, it says before we condemn or before we try to change a practice, we need to understand it as fully as possible and be aware of our own positionality. Anthropologists are constantly negotiating this tension. how to respect cultural difference while also recognizing harm and inequality when they happen. In this course, I'll be asking you to practice a kind of double vision. I want you to keep your own ethical commitments in view, but at the same time, I want you to learn to see things from others' vantage points before deciding what you think. Another key point: cultures are not frozen. They are always changing. They change as people experiment or borrow or resist or respond to new conditions. Diffusion refers to the spread of cultural elements across groups through contact and through exchange. Think about how foods like tomatoes, chilies, and potatoes traveled to the Americas, from the Americas to Europe, Asia, and Africa, and effectively reshaped food and cuisine worldwide. Or think about how K-pop and anime have become part of youth cultures that are really far away from Korea and Japan. That's diffusion. Then we have friction. Friction happens when different cultural elements rub up against each other and create tension. For example, new digital technologies can clash with older expectations about face-to-face communication, or even privacy or gender roles. That friction might lead to rules. It might also lead to backlash, or even sometimes to new hybrid practices. Friction. Then innovation. Innovation means giving a new twist to existing cultural forms. So a musician might blend traditional instruments with hip-hop beats and a deep bass drum, something like that. A religious group might reinterpret an old ritual to address a modern issue like climate change. And that's innovation. Finally, invention. Invention is the creation of something substantially new. A new technology, a political system, religious movement, you name it. Not every invention catches on. Sometimes, as with experimental dome houses or utopian communities, people reject a new idea because it doesn't fit their existing values or their constructions of what a home or a good life should be. The key idea here is that culture is both constraining and creative. It shapes what seems possible, but people are always pushing its boundaries, intentionally or not. Now, I want to invite all of you to pause again and reflect again. This time, take a few minutes to write or think through the following. First, describe one norm that you follow without thinking. It could be about how you say hello to someone. Do you shake their hand? Do you hug them? Do you kiss them? Or what you wear to class? Or how you use your phone at the dinner table? Maybe how you act in a group chat. How did you learn this norm? Think about that. And think about what happens socially or emotionally when someone breaks it. Next, describe one value that you were explicitly taught growing up. Maybe it was always tell the truth, or respect your elders, or work hard, or don't make a scene. Who taught it to you? Do you still agree with it? Or have you modified it over time? Finally, think of a practice, yours or someone else's, that you once thought was weird or gross or wrong until you learned more about its context. What changed your view? Was it meeting someone? Or watching a documentary? Maybe taking a class or traveling? These reflections will help you notice your own enculturation, as well as your shifting reactions to cultural difference. Save your notes. You might want to draw on them for assignments later in the course. The last section of chapter 1 zooms out to ask a very practical question. What can you actually do with anthropology? Anthropology gives you a cluster of skills and habits of mind that are increasingly valuable in many different fields. You learn to research, evaluate, and interpret complex social and natural data. So that might mean reading scientific studies, or analyzing interviews, or making sense of conflicting news reports. You practice critical, holistic thinking, looking at how economics, politics, culture, and the environment interact, rather than treating them as separate. You gain experience with qualitative methods like interviewing and participant observation, textual analysis, and often with basic quantitative or numerical methods as well. In anthropology, you also get better at intercultural communication. You learn how to listen carefully, how to ask good questions, and how to translate between different worldviews. You think seriously about ethics and what it means to work with communities in ways that are respectful and reciprocal. These skills, they can show up in many job titles. Maybe that's, program coordinator at a nonprofit, which is what I used to do before I taught at a university. User experience researcher in a tech company is another one. Or maybe community health worker, policy analyst, museum educator, archivist, journalist, social impact consultant, so many. And these are just a few. The point is, you don't have to become a professional anthropologist for this to matter. Anthropological ways of thinking, like being curious rather than judgmental, seeing the bigger picture, staying attentive to power and inequality, all of these things can shape how you show up as a nurse, a teacher, a lawyer, an engineer, or an artist. As we move through this course, I'll keep circling back to two questions. The first is, how does anthropology help us understand this topic more deeply? And the second is, how might these skills help you in your major, work, or life? So keep them in mind as we continue to go through this course.